thanks again for the invite to be here. I work at a place called University of Strathclyde, which is in Glasgow, in Scotland. But I think also I was wanting to talk about initially about the idea of identity, in that having a Scottish identity and an accent is often something I have to be careful with when I make sure I speak, but also that my own, I bumped into Flusser's work about 20 years ago when I was in art school, but I guess I also developed an identity with it, not just because of the writings, but this idea of groundlessness. My name, Anusas, is not Scottish, as you may have guessed, it's Lithuanian. And my grandfather was from Lithuania. He left from the Russo-Japanese War at the end of the turn of the century. And my mother's background is immigration from Ireland, which is closer to Scotland, of course. So for me, this idea of groundlessness is quite something in my own life, to some extent, of having a very strong identity being from a place, but then also having groundlessness in terms of a family who've come from different areas, but there was no lineage or history brought with it. So that was cut off completely from when people emigrated, from when they fled to Scotland. I worked in a mining community, which my grandfather did, and then cut off all those ties from before. And I think I think for me, this idea of groundlessness does make you question where you are, what you do, what practices, and how you think. And so it was when I was in art school, I bumped into this book. Someone in a bookshop recommended it to me. Thought I might be interested in it. I'll say that Flusser is, I know very few people. This is been very strange being here, because Flusser is very personal to me. I know very few people who do his work. I've not had much dialogue about it. So to then be in a room with lots of people that can dialogue about it is also both nice but strange. And I was studying engineering and design at the time. I then went on to work in industry for about 10 years. And mainly this essay, which is Design Obstacle 4.2, the removal of obstacles, kind of bothered me for about a decade as I worked in practice, but then continues to bother me and think about what it means for design. So most of my interpretations of Flusser's work are thinking about objects and technology and perception. I'm just going to read the first paragraph. An object is what gets in the way, a problem thrown into your path like a projectile. The world is objective, substantial, and problematic as long as it obstructs. An object of use is an object which one uses and needs to get other objects out of the way. This definition contains within it a contradiction. An obstacle 4.2, the removal of obstacles. This dialectic can be summed up as follows. If I come across obstacles in my path, I come across the objective, substantial, and problematic world. I overturn some of these obstacles. I transform them into objects of use, into culture. In order to continue, then the objects thus overturned prove to be obstacles in themselves. The more I continue, the more I am obstructed by objects of use, more in the form of cars and administrative machinery than in the form of hailstones or man-eating tigers. I am in fact doubly obstructed. First, because I use them in order to continue, and second, because they get in my way. To put it another way, the more I continue, the more objective, substantial, and problematic culture becomes. So this for me is like, sums up a huge contemporary issue in design. So we design objects, design things, with forms which are becoming more and more sealed, having hardened surfaces, harder to penetrate or take apart or understand. And they create, for me, a number of issues. One is an object so they are objects of use. So as a designer or engineer, you design something to shape the world in a way to make it useful, this idea of progression and doing something good in the world. So you develop something to make life better, but then it becomes a problem. And then in being a problem, because let's say it doesn't work very well or it doesn't connect to the internet, I'll then design something else that's better. And then this is a problem too, so I'll design something else that's better, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And so it's a complete vicious circle. So the design has itself in of a approaching the world as a problem, objectifying it, containing it, describing it, designing for it, and then culture's constantly shifting. So when you're designing, you're often designing for something that's going to be produced 6 months or a year or 2 years from now. And by the time it comes into effect, things have changed, and things are always changing. So it's a fundamental sort of conundrum of design. Secondly, perception. Most objects are designed in product design since the modernist period to be enclosures. In fact, I think reflective surfaces are particularly interesting. So you reflect back on yourself. So the thing becomes more like an image, in a sense. And this is one of the things that Flusser's work I'm very interested in, is that when we consume objects, when we use objects, we're also involved in a constellation of image. So we see the image of the object and know the object, particularly in the case of companies like Apple, will project those images very deeply into the senses prior to even encountering the object. So there's issues with image, but there's also issues of perception. When I use this object, when I'm in this room, the walls are opaque, the surfaces are opaque, I don't know where the energy comes from, I don't know where the water comes from, I don't know where electricity comes from, and so objects essentially they do something which is, they distinguish between the surface and infrastructure. So some materials are taken to be infrastructure, and some materials are taken to be surface. Surfaces are usually occlusion, completely whole, and then the infrastructure, or perhaps the apparatus, is the thing behind the scenes that's making it work. So that's for me an issue of perception, environmental perception, how we come to know where we are in the world and what we're doing. And then the other issue is waste. Of course, an object is a sealed entity, and in being a sealed entity and not necessarily dialogic in a true sense, we have piles and piles of waste. So what we have in product design is we have in a way, Flusser's philosophy of photography is a proliferation of image. The way I see it is a proliferation of object. So mounting and mounting objects, mounting piles of waste, and a continual sort of problem. So most of my work has been like, well, how do you solve this issue? How do you address this issue? What do you do? Can you do anything? And that takes us into discussion about the terms of the apparatus and how you involve yourself in it. So, as I say, my own background is in product design, but I was in practice, and then I've been in academia for about the last 10 years, but then I went back into practice as part of my thesis for 8 months, working with product designers, who, in a sense, you can question, is this the apparatus? So I went to look at designers from an anthropological point of view to try and understand what is the point of where materials become objects. How are they interpreted and understood to become objects? So you can think that designers might start with lots of raw materials, and then they're working with this. And so one question I have is like, where is the apparatus? How do we involve ourselves in it? But then the other thing, which has particularly struck me through the process working with designers, is they're dealing with objects. So when they come to design something, they're confronted with already the projection and history of something else. So in this case, this might appear to a layperson some part of infrastructure. To the designer it might be familiar, but then things are always formed. This is a kind of composite material. This is a kind of foam board. These are quite common sorts of things people use in product design. Usually materials come in a planar surface, cylindrical forms. There's obviously fluids involved in various things. But these, in a way, the designer's caught in a position of working with objects. And so they can only form what's been given to them. And again, this occurs through things like digital media. So the computational systems in design and engineering are largely, to my understanding, based on object ontology. So when you work in a digital system, like this is a typical one that would be used, you're not dealing with a completely open space. And it was a bit this idea of the designer who starts from a blank sheet of paper and can imagine anything is a fallacy. In a sense, they always start with some substrate. They always start with some ground and some ground conditions. And so what appears like virtual space is actually a mathematical constellation. So these forms that can be generated computationally are based on particular mathematical parameters which tend to move things towards the object, tend to move towards distinctions of inside and outside, interior and exterior. So one of my kind of interests are what happens when you start to think about making differently. And this is a question, obviously, which Flusser raises, and he asks, what form must I give these projected designs so that those coming after me can use them to help me continue and at the same time avoid being obstructed as much as possible? This is both a political and aesthetic question, and it forms the central concern when it comes to creating things. And so for me, what's particularly interesting about Flusser's work is the intertwining of the apparatus with power relations, with ideas of theology, and how those are all intermixed. So essentially, when you're dealing with materials in some form, you're already dealing with some form of object ontology, if you like, that you're working with, and it's going to then roll out particular forms. So this is the work that also brought me to anthropology. A lot of my thinking and work's influenced by Tim Ingold, who's my kind of supervisor and colleague, and he writes a lot on ideas of lines and weaving, and using weaving as a different sort of, if you like, ontology for how you might make things, or how you might understand the world, and draws together a connection between how writing is a gesture, and how letters form and words form, and making is all part of a gestural process. So my kind of work in the field has really been trying to understand, when you have an end object, is to try and understand what are the making practices, the drawing practices, the gestural practices, and the practices of language. And so actually language and form become intertwined through gesture. So one thing is a question of cohesion. This is a kind of question for me, is how cohesive can you make things for them to be useful, but then reinterpretable. So this is a bird's nest, and I find bird's nests quite interesting because they're cohesive. Yeah, you can pick them up. They're fairly cohesive. They seem like a thing, but then as deliberately it's falling apart. So in Flusser's term, is open to the wind, open to the spirit, is this idea that it can be reinterpreted. Where this thing here is much more cohesive, but less interpretable from material regeneration point of view. And then other questions. You know, if we're going to try and deal with the apparatus, do we go into workshops, look at materials, or do we have to go right back and look at mining? And in a way, successful design companies use this to their advantage. Companies like Apple know very clearly about how to work the apparatus for successful products. And it's particularly because they understand those power relations and material relations that they're able to make so-called beautiful objects, because they own mines and they own a lot of material lineages, more so than many other companies. I'm just going to finish by some words from an architect who a friend recommended I read, which is my obsession with objects. And this is I'd really recommend it. It's Anti-Object by Kengo Kuma. He's a very successful Japanese architect, and I'll read one or two bits of the text. So one of the things is, to be precise, an object is a form of material existence distinct from its immediate environment. And Kengo Kuma's kind of position here in this book is that the object way of thinking is fundamentally what's influencing modern architecture. Making architecture into objects was a basic principle of the pre-modern architecture in the West. But even 20th century modernism, which ostensibly strove for transparency and openness, was deeply tainted by the disease of objectification. Indeed, objectification might be said to be the very strategy by which modernism succeeded in conquering the world. My criticism developed into a criticism of architecture itself, both its form and its destiny. I could not help criticising architecture. Equally, I could not help criticising and disavowing my own work as an architect. And for me, it's a very introspective piece of work, as case studies of his projects, where he's been given briefs and he's tried to conceptualise something as not being an object. And so similarly to Flusser, he says, I would like to create buildings that open up opportunities for connecting the subject to the world. A towering object-orientated architecture impedes such a connection. A perfectly transparent architecture also has difficulty serving as a medium. And this is what's particularly interesting, where things can become so non-cohesive or diffuse that it's not really an entity which you can gather. Using actual matter, I would like to create an architecture that mediates and relates. He does reference many philosophers, but not Flusser, and the parallel between that and his essay for me is particularly strong. And what interested me is this possibility of what would a dialogic form be, and how would that work. And this is one of his pieces of architecture, this kind of experimental piece, where if you like, the surface of the architecture is broke. It's hard to ascertain the surface, essentially. And if you look at a lot of your clothing, different from products like wool clothing, it's very hard to actually put your finger on where the line of the surface is. And similarly, he does here. So I'm very much interested in surface relations and what that reveals about infrastructures and the workings behind. And last image is, this is a very, I don't know how many people know of Maggie Orth's work. She's based in Seattle as an electronic textiles designer. But for me, this is a really interesting piece of work in that these textiles effectively disrupt any idea of surface or infrastructure. So that what's infrastructural and what's surface become woven together. So what this is a computational device, but it's based on a fabric. And so with Tim Ingold and the work that we're doing in anthropology, a lot of us looking at how can the idea of the fabric, the weave, disrupt these dualities and think about things as being interstitial in that sense. Just to mention two of the kind of groups I'm working with. There's a research network for design anthropology. It's mainly based in Denmark and Scotland and other Scandinavian countries, has some other connections in Europe. And that's a collection of practicing designers, design researchers, anthropologists, all interested in these ideas of making, different ways of thinking about participation. And also, the main project I'm involved in now, which quite ties into what Anke was mentioning earlier, is the Knowing for the Insight project, which this project seeks to reconfigure the relation between practices of inquiry in the human sciences and the forms of knowledge to which it gives rise. Its fundamental premise is that knowledge is not created through an encounter between minds furnished with concepts and theories, but a material world already populated with objects, but grows from the crucible of our practical and observational engagement with the world around us. And so much of this project involves many researchers looking at architectural, craft, clay, wood, and then myself looking at kind of the mix of digital and production practices. And so that's a 5-year project involved to try and open up some of these issues about different forms of knowledge from different disciplines and how they can disrupt some of the more conventional ways of doing academic research.